I had climbed 4 continental high points, before I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2015. So that became a big motivation for me to beat cancer, and also a big motivation for me to keep climbing.
For our second Encore episode, we're re-airing an episode that was released early last year. In March 2023, I shared an inspiring conversation with Lisa Thompson, who is a Seattle-based mountaineer, author, and breast cancer survivor. She is the second American woman to summit K2 and has summited the highest mountain on all 7 continents. In this episode, she talks about what first inspired her to get into mountaineering, how climbing gave her the motivation she needed to get through her breast cancer diagnosis, how the mountains have shaped her as a woman, overcoming the limiting beliefs we put on ourselves, women in the wilderness, and so much more. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Lisa and that it inspires you to really take life by the horns like it did for me. I am so excited about our guest today. She is a local Seattle mountaineer, breast cancer survivor, author, and personally an outdoor inspiration to me. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do you just want to start off by maybe telling us a bit about your climbing experience?
Yeah. So most people are curious about how I started climbing, especially because I grew up in the Midwest, and I don't think I even knew where big mountains like Everest were until I was probably in my 30s. At that point, I'd moved from the Midwest, from Illinois specifically, where the highest point is 1,200 feet, by the way. So I moved from there here to Seattle, which is where I live today. And I like to say that I started climbing out of spite, which is maybe not the best motivation, or maybe it's a really good motivation. But at that point in my career, I was the only woman at my level at the healthcare company that I worked for. And all of the men who were my peers would regularly go climbing somewhere in the Cascades, because climbing here in Seattle is just a really big part of the culture.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no interest in climbing a mountain or even really pushing myself outside. I was an outdoor person, but I, like to go for a walk or do something pretty chill outside. But when my peers would come back to the office on Monday mornings, they had these incredible stories about waiting out a storm together in a tent on the side of a mountain, or about navigating through crevasses on a glacier together as a team. And I really longed to be considered part of their group. I wanted them to see me as capable. As the only woman on the team, that was super important to me. But at that point, I was in my mid-20s then. I didn't have the courage or the voice to just say hey, climbing, it sounds super fun. Why don't I join you sometime? Instead, I just got really frustrated. And I remember going back to my cube and slamming on my keyboard and deciding I was just going to climb my own mountains. And I had no idea what that meant. And started, hiking at first, and then decided that I would attempt Rainier with a guided group a couple years later. And I didn't summit Rainier on my first attempt, but I went back the following year because there was just something about the challenge of climbing a big peak that really motivated me. Mm-hmm. And I also loved the idea that people thought I couldn't do it, and that I had a chance to prove them wrong. And I also fell in love with the mental and physical component of climbing a big peak. And so when I summited Rainier for the first time in 2009, I was pretty much addicted at that point. And I started choosing another more challenging mountain somewhere in the world every year. And I had climbed 4 continental high points before I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2015. So that became a big motivation for me to beat cancer, and also a big motivation for me to keep climbing.
Yes. I feel like just hearing about your climbing experience to start resonates with me so personally because my partner, my boyfriend, he's really into climbing, really into outdoor adventuring, skiing, mountaineering, you name it. But when him and his friends are talking, they always have these like lofty goals and these lofty adventures, and kind of
Totally.
sounds just like those guys that you worked with, where it's like, I kind of want to do that, but like some part of me doesn't totally feel capable and it frustrates me
Absolutely.
too. I'm like, I feel so powerful in all these other ways, but for some reason I feel like, why can't I join their adventures? And like, why can't I do these hard things too? So I just like would love to like learn more about kind of how you overcame like those barriers that we put on ourselves, I feel like so frequently as women, um,
Yeah.
in entering like a male dominated kind of sport.
I don't think I overcame them very gracefully in the beginning. I didn't really have any great role models, female role models back then. And I think there are a ton of them now. And maybe I just wasn't looking in the right places back then. But I think then it was really just like grit and like muscling my way through things and like being determined not to give up.
Mm-hmm.
Not always the most graceful approach to something. Um, and later, after my diagnosis, I really stopped, as cancer does to so many people,
Mm-hmm.
and started to evaluate what was important to me. And it was at that point that I started to realize how much mountains were teaching me
Mm,
about not just what I was capable of, but also about who I am as a woman and what's important to me and how I want to spend my time. And
mm-hmm.
so spite, I think, is the genesis of my climbing, but it really can only get you so far.
Yeah.
Um, Shortly after, before I was diagnosed, I had decided to climb for the first time in the Himalaya. And so that was a really pivotal point in my climbing resume because it felt very pivotal to me that I was finally ready to climb a big mountain. So
How many
in
years had it been since you first started climbing to deciding that you wanted to climb the Himalayas?
it had been 7 years.
Okay, 7 years.
Yeah. And a pretty steady, like every year picking a different peak and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about the skills I needed to gain and to get comfortable with in order to kind of move on to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a pretty ad hoc process. Like, and now, if I had to do it all over again, I would join like a mountaineering organization that would kind of walk you through that in a more structured way. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
I was, sort of flailing around, and I learned a lot by climbing on guided teams too, commercial guided
Mm-hmm.
teams. Um, and then in 2015, had set this goal and was diagnosed with breast cancer the following month. And
Mm-hmm.
that, caused me to really evaluate everything going on in my life. But I knew I was so stubborn still.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't ready to give up this goal of attempting my first Himalayan peak. And I remember sitting in my oncology surgeon's office in tears, trying to hold back tears because I didn't want her to think I was weak in any way. And saying something like, hey, what if we just postponed this whole thing?
You're like, let's just put off this cancer diagnosis thing. Like I have other things I need to achieve.
Which is so ridiculous. I was so focused that time on not letting cancer dictate my priorities,
Mm-hmm.
because that made me feel like I had some sense of control. But looking back, of course, cancer is going to dictate your priorities. It should dictate your
Mm-hmm.
priorities. And so I was trying to convince my surgeon to, I would go to Nepal and climb, and then I'd come back, and then we'll start working on this cancer thing when I get back. And she and I laugh about that today. Um, and she very compassionately said that, I don't remember her exact words, but they included something about being foolhardy. And, I realized that I needed to listen to my body and
Mm-hmm.
focus on beating cancer before I continued climbing.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel like your climbing background and just learning how to really navigate like literally difficult terrain kind of helped prepare you in some ways for navigating and facing your diagnosis?
I think it made me more tenacious. And I think having the goal of wanting to climb as a motivator was really huge to me.
Mm-hmm.
I remember like when I, was going under anesthetic to have a bilateral mastectomy, the surgeon said to me, just think about standing on the top of that mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And there were so many times when I used that visual as something to get me through a hard moment.
Mm-hmm.
And there were also, climbing and cancer are so closely intertwined for me that I really can't separate them, because there were plenty of moments too where when I had cancer where I would say like, is this it? Like, is this all that I'm capable of? That I was feeling very distraught or, frustrated at what my body could do, or frustrated at the decisions that I had to make. And that same question of what I'm capable of is something that I ask myself in the mountains still.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that got me through the hardest moments on K2, for example.
I would love to just hear a little bit more about that. Like, what do you tell yourself to like get through those hard moments? When you're on the side of a mountain and it almost is life or death situations at some point, like one wrong foot could really make a big impact. And
Yes.
so how do you mentally like deal with those big moments? And I know that's almost like potentially an impossible question to answer, but
Well, there was one of those moments when I was descending K2 that I write about in my book. And it was a moment where I was descending and I was rappelling. So I was sort of backing down the ice like a fireman would rappel off a building. And there was a man on the rope below me that I had to navigate around. He was fine, but he was just struggling and like laying on the ice. And I remember just breathing, like just telling myself to focus on my breath, to keep myself calm. Because in that moment, I couldn't make a single mistake. I had to anchor myself and maneuver around him in the most dangerous place on that mountain, and a place that if I made a mistake, I would fall and die. And I have to focus on every task and executing it perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny that idea of perfection is something I've struggled with my whole life. And many, many women do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting.
I can relate.
Yes. It's interesting to me that there are moments where I need that sense of perfection, and there are moments where I need to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
And I think climbing has taught me the difference between the two. When it's a moment where I need it and I need to rely on it, I'm very grateful that I have that skill and that focus. But when it comes to vacuuming, I don't need that level of perfection in my life.
I feel that. So I did just want to hear a little bit more about your accomplishments in your career as a mountaineer. You were the second American woman to summit K2.
Yeah.
You've summited Everest, Mount Kilimanjaro. There's a whole long list on your website of different mountains that you've summited. What was the climb that you enjoyed the most?
So the one that I enjoyed the most actually just happened this past fall. So climbing is often considered a pretty selfish endeavor. And I don't disagree with that, because very few people other than me benefit from me attempting a mountain or standing on the summit of any mountain. And as you know, I've been climbing now for 15 years, and that really started to bother me that, there was, who cares if I stood on a summit or not? It felt very selfish. And so I was talking like a year and a half ago with some girlfriends who are also climbers, and we all felt like this. And so we decided we wanted to create an all women's expedition, which came together last fall. And we wanted that expedition to benefit women in some way. We had all been to Nepal many times and felt very connected to the people and the culture, and wanted to give back to that community that meant so much to us and that's added so much to our lives. And so we, along with a Nepalese friend, built an all women's team. And so even like the whole group, women porters, female base camp crew, And it was and we also raised money to support girls' education in Nepal in a pretty impoverished village where girls are often trafficked by their family because they're usually not educated and are seen as a burden to a family that's very poor. And so we raised money. We raised $18,000 to send girls to school to prevent them from being trafficked. And we built this team of all women and paid them more than they would make otherwise working in the mountains, and intentionally worked with women that, like, maybe their husband had died in an avalanche on the mountain, or their husband was ill and they needed to be the breadwinner for the family. We hired women who had never walked more than 2 days from their village in their whole life. And it was such a rewarding, powerful experience to climb with them and to see the difference we were making in their lives. I actually heard through a friend, I was talking to another Nepalese friend who owns a guide company, and she's like, yeah, I've been hiring the women from that expedition. And so it's just, seeing that trickle out is so meaningful to me. It was so meaningful to climb with all women. And, we had all more than once been the only woman on a team, and understood the pressure that creates, which is often self-inflicted. In my case, it very often is self-inflicted. And we felt none of that. Like, we just created this really strong, supportive group. And we did it to benefit other women in Nepal, which was amazing. So that, I know I didn't say a single thing about the climb itself, which was a very beautiful peak called Cholatsi in Nepal, but it was just, what I gained and what I learned about how I want to spend my time, and the way I want to climb in the future was really poignant on that trip.
Yeah. And how rewarding too, when you said that, like, you started out and you didn't really have many women mentors in mountaineering or climbing. And now you're able to essentially like create that for other women, and then even go beyond that and not just be like a role model, but like genuinely help these people's lives and like improve the communities that you're going into.
Yeah.
That's so beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really special. Yeah.
So for those who want to get more of an inside look specifically into your Everest climb, there is a documentary about it, right?
It is, yes. Capturing Everest.
Yes. And is the only way to watch it in virtual reality? I was trying to look into it.
You can watch it if you watch it on your phone. It's in 360 video. So, if you could just like then move your phone around as it's playing, you get a view of the whole scene.
Gotcha. That is super cool and something I definitely want to check out.
Yeah, it was a fun, I wasn't involved in actually filming it, but it was fun to be on an expedition where things were being filmed. It created a whole nother level of stress.
Oh my gosh, I can imagine.
I don't want to be doing something stupid. And there was I at one point was using the bathroom outside of a tent and didn't realize that the camera was right there. So there were lots of moments where like just a whole nother level of
yeah. I bet. I kind of wanted to go back to you talking about like feeling like climbing is sometimes like a selfish endeavor. From like a family perspective or even a partner. Like I said, my boyfriend, he's super into climbing, but of course, I mean, he's very smart and he goes with friends and he always checks avalanche conditions, all that kind of stuff. But like, I still always worry about him. So it's like, such a balance between like, I know I need to like allow him to embrace that passion because that's like what gives him life and it fuels him and just like makes him feel whole. But it's so hard from the opposite perspective too, like worrying about your loved one and just thinking about like what could go wrong. So I guess I don't really have a question, but just that kind of idea overall is like just something I think about a lot.
And I've thought about it too, because I'm always on the opposite side of that. I'm the one making the decision that can be painful for other people who care about me. And I think early on when I was climbing, my family was always super supportive and like they were my biggest cheerleaders, even though they have lived in Illinois their whole lives and don't really understand or get it, but they were always very encouraging and excited and wanted to hear stories about what I was climbing next and how it went. And, that was especially true after I beat cancer and decided to climb Mount Everest. And they, are super into that. And then I decided to climb K2.
They're like, are you done yet?
Yeah. And K2 it's the second highest mountain in the world, but it's considered by many people to be the most dangerous mountain. And so it was very hard for my family to understand why I would choose to put my life at risk to that degree. My father also, right after I finished climbing Everest, I learned he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung and brain cancer. He died about a month after I got home. And so it was hard for the rest of my family to comprehend why I would risk that after just, fighting for my life myself and then watching my father die of cancer. And I felt that. I mean, I felt like the difference in vibe when we would talk about it. And I saw, how they wouldn't look me in the eye anymore when I talked about climbing. And I knew that was all coming from a place of love and concern. And I had to respect that they were going through their process just like I was. And it made me really question my decision making for a long time. If I was, being selfish, if I was letting my ambition get ahead of my ability. And I sat with that for a very long time and finally felt like there was just this small but mighty voice or feeling inside of me that knew I needed to give that mountain a try, and that knew I could do it, and that I could do it as safely as possible. K2 is a very deadly mountain. I think depending on the stats, like something like 1 in 4 people will die attempting the summit. And I couldn't deny to my family that that was a possible outcome by choosing to climb it. But I could promise them that I would be smart on the mountain and I would always make good decisions and I wouldn't climb above my ability. And I'm grateful that they stuck in there with me and supported me. And I'm grateful that everything went well.
Absolutely. I mean, I just finished the book, The Alchemist, and it's reminding me of like fulfilling your personal legend. It's just like you had that like intuition that you're just like, I need to complete this. And sometimes it's just that.
Yep. And sometimes, I mean, it's hard because I knew that my family loved me and they were legitimately and fairly concerned, but there was just this part of me that needed to do it.
Well, I'm also really sorry to hear about the passing of your dad.
Thank you.
Were you all diagnosed around the same time?
So I was diagnosed in 2015 and he was diagnosed in 2016. So
okay, so pretty close.
And it was, I finally decided you never get to check the cancer box. Like it's always going to be a part of your life. And I had sort of naively thought that once I was cancer free, like I was good, I'm done, like moving on. And that, of course, is not how it works. And it was a whole different challenge supporting my dad because I had chosen to fight cancer with every resource I could think of. And he took a very different path and, chose to like let cancer win. And that was really, really hard for me to not see him fight the way I thought he should be fighting. But it was a very important lesson to me in understanding that people have to create their own path and live, just like we were talking about climbing, like that was his truth. That's what he needed to do.
Yeah.
And I had to be supportive and do everything I could to allow him to do that the way he needed to.
It's seriously one of the hardest things to do when you're just like, I don't see it this way and I love you so much. And this seems to have worked for me. And I just obviously want you here with me, but like.
Yes. Yeah. It's about surrendering and trusting other people to follow the path that's right for them. Not easy at all.
And that is what's so like tricky about cancer too, is so many types, so many different treatments, so many different like socio-emotional needs
Mhm.
associated with it, so many different ways of like having hope to kind of get through that diagnosis. Like we've
Yep.
been talking about, like for you, it was very much like climbing and having this goal of like, I need to do this, and this is really my
Yes.
motivator. But it
Yes.
sounds like just throughout so many conversations that I've had, like having that motivator and that hope of like that one thing that just like pushes you and fuels you is just like so critically important.
I mean, it really, really is. And as I, work with cancer organizations today, I really encourage that for people to find the thing, whatever it is, like your children, your garden, like a vacation you want to take. I just think it's so hard to get through a difficult diagnosis in a situation where you feel like you have so little control without some big motivation on the other side of it.
Absolutely. So is your diagnosis still impacting your life today when it comes to climbing? Like I know, of course, with survivorship, sometimes there's a lot of like follow-up and scans and different things that you still have to
Yeah,
deal
I
with.
passed the 5-year mark this past summer,
Yay. Yay,
which
yay,
I was
yay.
it was mixed emotion. I was like, wait, I want to come see you every 6 months. I was like, I need my safety net a little bit. Um, so today, I think the impact that it has is just on keeping me grateful for
Mhm.
everything my body has done for me and everything that has been through and everything I've asked of it, that it has always delivered. And as I get older, 50 now, I feel a stronger sense of taking care of it. Like in my 30s, I was, really, you feel like you're invincible. But as I get older, I realize how important it is to like be grateful and take care of it.
Mhm. I
Yeah.
feel that too. I mean, I'm like nearing 30, but I still feel like there are like I'm so much more mindful of like taking care of my body, and especially
Good.
just in the work that I do, like
Right.
sunscreen,
Oh
healthy
yes.
diet, like all the
Yoga,
things,
like
limiting alcohol
reducing your
intake.
stress. Yes. All those
Yes.
things make a huge difference, and good for you for realizing that 2 decades
It's so
I did.
important.
It
So
is.
important.
It really is.
I would also like to talk about and touch on just naturally women in the wilderness.
Yeah.
Because so many barriers on ourselves when it comes to like
Mhm.
going into the outdoors, even like me thinking about wanting to go on a hike if like my boyfriend or friends aren't in town, and I never really just go do it by myself, even though like why not? Like I
Right.
should.
Right.
But I feel like there are just so many barriers, whether they're mental or like fear based,
Yep.
about going out into the wilderness. So do you have any like suggestions or tips for women on how to overcome those?
It's an awesome question. And I'm super passionate about helping women find themselves and their voices and their confidence through the outdoors because it's been such a big part of my life and had such a big impact on my life. I think if you can find someone to do it with, like another woman, I think that's great. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
probably the best scenario. And especially if you endeavor to do something that's, maybe more challenging than what you've been doing. So if, you always go on a hike around Seattle and you want to go hike in Death Valley, for example, or do something a little more challenging, I think it's great to have someone that's got a little bit more experience than you that you can learn from. I was super fortunate in my matriculation as a climber that was always men, but usually men that I could ask questions of and like go on hikes with or go on climbs with and learn from. And so having that kind of mentor mentee relationship, I think is really important. For women, there are a lot of female only hiking groups and climbing groups, at least in the Pacific Northwest,
Mm-hmm.
or even just Facebook groups. And I think that's a resource that I didn't know existed or didn't look for when I was starting out. So I think that's important. And I think it's also useful to think about, what am I fearful of in this scenario? Like, what am I worried about? And to really have a conversation with that fear about, am I worried about getting lost? Am I worried about getting injured and not, having a way to get back to safety? And then thinking about where that fear is coming from. I've been really working a lot lately on recognizing my emotions and thinking
Oh
about where
yeah.
they're coming from,
Mm-hmm.
which doesn't come natural to me at all. And often, there's a story that I'm telling myself that is usually not based in reality.
You're speaking my language right now.
And
The
so I really
stories we tell ourselves.
yeah, it's totally a story that comes from fear or some limiting belief that I have, or something that happened to me as a kid that has, left a mark on me as an adult, and trying to get to the root of that and then thinking about it logically helps me a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think just have a backup plan. Like if you're going on your own for the first time, tell a friend, like, this is where I'm going and this is about what time I expect to be back, and know that you've got that safety net there in case you need it is important.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the best tips that I've gotten, and one that's really resonated with me is plan for what you're afraid of. Like,
Yes.
if you're afraid of people coming into your tent, like figure out a little way to like latch your tent a little bit more secure, or also just like trusting your gut. Like if you feel weird and you've like set up at a campsite and you're like, all right, there's like some people around, but I just like feel off, like trust that. And like,
Absolutely trust
don't have
it.
to stay. Like,
Yes. I would say that I'm so passionate about it that I've started to organize some all women's climbs. So I'm doing the first one. This whole climb in Nepal last year really spawned this for me, and I'm like investigating how far I want to take this. But I've partnered with a local guide company called Mountain Madness, and we're doing an all women's climb of Mount Baker this summer.
nice.
To benefit female cancer survivors. And so I'm super excited to do more of that. And it's that Mount Baker is a great climb for women. If you're like been hiking for a long time and you're interested in climbing something and learning a little bit, it's going to be a super supportive environment of just women, only 6 of us, unless we get enough to have 2 teams. And I'm super stoked about it.
So you have a new book that just came out,
Yes.
Finding Elevation. Do you want to tell us a bit about that and where people can maybe find out more?
Yeah. So it's Finding Elevation is, at its heart, it's a climbing memoir. So if you're curious about what it's like to climb a big mountain like Everest or K2, it will be interesting to you. And especially if you're curious about what it's like to climb those mountains as a woman, I think you'll find it interesting. But it's also a very deep and personal exploration into human motivation and risk taking. And it's a story about what happens when we finally stop letting other people define what we're capable of. And we face our fears and our uncertainty head on. And it's been a 7-year process for me to write and publish. I was speaking last night and someone asked me if it's harder to climb mountains or to write about them. And it's so much harder for me to write about them because of this whole vulnerability element that is a challenge for me. But it really is a story. One reviewer said it's a story from self-doubt to self-discovery. So it's it's written in a period of time when there was a lot of like tumultuousness in my life. And I was diagnosed with cancer. I got a divorce. I quit my job. I focused on climbing. And then my father was diagnosed with cancer. And then I made the decision to climb K2. And so there are a lot of anecdotes about what I learned during that time and about resilience and surrender and being true to who you are.
Awesome.
And you can, anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Please check out your local independent bookstores too. And if they don't have it, they'll be happy to order for you. It's really been a very rewarding process for me to publish and to hear and get feedback from people. It's been great.
Yeah, well, what an accomplishment writing a book. Like that is, like you said, 7 years in the process, like no small task.
No, writing is not for the faint of heart at all.
No. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. This conversation
It's my pleasure.
So enlightening and empowering, and I'm so excited to share it with the world. So I appreciate you. If you're looking for breast cancer support resources, I encourage you to check out the National Breast Cancer Foundation and breastcancer.org. We also have a variety of support groups here at Cancer Pathways to support those who are newly diagnosed, loved ones, caregivers, and more. If you're local to Washington State and a cancer survivor looking for a new outdoor activity to try out, check out Team Survivor Northwest. They have a lot of great activities, everything from mountain climbing, fitness classes to dragon boating. All of those links are going to be included in this episode's description. Thank you again for tuning in, and until next time, please stay healthy and well.